And with that, I would now like to formally begin today's conference and introduce Luke Hanna.
Thank you, Colin. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. We're pleased to have you all with us for this webinar presented by Kate Williams from Biodiversity Research Institute on some of the results from their Mid-Atlantic baseline study. As Colin previously mentioned, we will be taking your questions at the end, so feel free to type your questions in or raise your hand, and we will hopefully be able to get to all of the questions. This webinar will be recorded and can be accessed through the TETHIS website afterward. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Jocelyn Brown-Saraceno with the U.S. Department of Energy Wind and Water Power Technologies Office. Jocelyn?
Thanks, Luke. On behalf of the Department of Energy's Wind and Water Power Technologies Office, I would just like to welcome everybody to this webinar today. And I'm going to take just a few minutes before Kate Williams dives into the results of this study to speak about DOE's impetus for funding this work and also how this work fits within our broader offshore wind research portfolio. So Kate, could I ask you to advance to the next slide, please? Okay, thanks. So this project was really born out of our national offshore wind strategy, which was published by the Department of Interior and the Department of Energy jointly in 2011. And that offshore wind strategy had two critical objectives. The first was reducing the cost of energy through technology development, and the second was reducing deployment timelines and uncertainties. So next slide. Okay, that's perfect. And so following the release of that strategy, the U.S. Department of Energy released a suite of funding opportunities to really help meet those objectives and fund priority work to make that strategy and those objectives a reality. And that work ranged from solicitations and funding work such as next-generation drivetrains, demonstration projects, and the solicitation that this project was funded, which was a solicitation that funded a suite of work aimed at removing market barriers, including addressing siting and permitting needs, infrastructure needs, and resource planning. Next slide. And in that 2011 solicitation, DOE sought to fund a multi-year comprehensive baseline ecological study of the waters off of the mid-Atlantic with associated predictive modeling and mapping activities. And the goal here was really to help build the knowledge base necessary for the effective and efficient permitting and siting of offshore wind facilities in the outer continental shelf of the mid-Atlantic, with a particular focus on the Department of Interior's wind energy areas. And we had three major goals for this study. One was to focus on species of particular relevance in the context of permitting and environmental review of offshore wind projects. And the aim here was really to significantly increase the temporal and spatial resolution of data on those species. To encourage the use of novel methodologies that could help advance how we conduct this sort of research moving forward. And then finally, to utilize and improve upon predictive models to really help us translate that survey data into density estimates that incorporate data such as biologically relevant data such as habitat characteristics and oscillations. Next slide. So Kate today will be talking through the results of this study and some of the study impacts, but at the outset I just wanted to note that this study really helps improve the understanding of species composition and use in the mid-Atlantic. It delivers 2 years of high-quality baseline data to the wind energy development community, to regulators, to environmental stakeholders, to the public, and we would encourage you to visit the BRI website and access the data there if you have interest in using that data moving forward. And finally, this project really helps advance the state-of-the-art of monitoring technologies and associated methodologies. Next slide. So before I pass it over to Kate, I want to give a big thank you both to the funding partners who both helped contribute to funding this effort, and for some of these efforts that DOE dollars supported larger efforts that they're working on, and also a huge thank you to the BRI team and all associated project partners that helped make this work a reality. This is a large and multi-year project, and a huge amount of work went into making this a reality. So thanks to all who have helped to make this happen. And with that, I will pass the presentation over to Kate to give you more detail about the study and what was found.
All right. Thank you very much, Jocelyn. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep, sound loud and clear.
All right, thanks. So I'm Kate Williams. I work for the Biodiversity Research Institute. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, BRI is a nonprofit research organization based in Maine. And as Jocelyn mentioned, I'll be talking today about a research effort that we started in 2011 that's aimed at informing the development of offshore wind energy in the U.S. Next slide. I have a long list of co-authors for this talk, including folks from BRI as well as North Carolina State University, the College of Staten Island, Duke University, and Oregon State. And I'll try and call out their respective contributions as we discuss various project components, but most of what we're discussing today is the result of collaborative efforts among multiple organizations. Next. The project is funded by the Wind and Water Power Technologies Office at DOE as well as the state of Maryland. And support for certain project components have also come from a variety of other sources, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Migratory Birds Division, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, CDEC Joint Venture, and private foundations. And in addition to co-authors on this talk today, we have a lot of collaborators and partners on this project, many of which have been involved specifically with satellite telemetry studies. Our telemetry results are actually part of 2 multi-year collaborative projects that are still ongoing on the movement patterns of red-throated loons, northern gannets, and surf scoter flyway. I'm not really going to get into the telemetry efforts today. Those projects are hoping to publish results starting next year, but I wanted to acknowledge this large group of funders and collaborators that have helped make the project happen. Next slide, please. Offshore wind energy development has progressed rapidly in Europe since the first facility became operational in 1991, and it's now being pursued in the U.S. as well. And this renewable resource has the potential to reduce global carbon emissions and thus to positively affect many species. But offshore wind energy developments may also affect the local wildlife more directly. And we're still learning about how offshore wind energy facilities affect marine ecosystems, but it seems clear that effects vary during different development phases and that species can respond in a variety of ways. Some species are negatively affected, others seem to show no net effect or may even be affected positively. And possible effects to fish, marine mammals, sea turtles, birds, and bats seem to include mortality or injury from collisions with turbines or vessels, displacement from or attraction to habitat use areas, avoidance of the areas around facilities during migration or daily movements, which may necessitate increased energetic expenditures, and changes to habitat or prey populations. And overall, the cumulative effects to wildlife will be dependent on the size and number of facilities that are built, as well as local topography, climate, species ranges, and behaviors, and other factors. And so physical and ecological context is really essential for understanding and minimizing effects of offshore development on wildlife. Next slide. So our goal for this study was to provide regulators, developers, and other stakeholders for offshore wind energy with comprehensive baseline ecological data and associated analyses to try and build a knowledge base for siting and permitting offshore facilities on the mid-Atlantic outer continental shelf. And our focus here was on potential exposure, so understanding what species may have higher or lower levels of exposure to development activities in the mid-Atlantic and where and when that exposure could occur. So the next step after that would be to incorporate information on species behaviors maybe, or their population status, to try and understand their potential to be affected by offshore wind. But our data collection for this study was focused on that first step of understanding their baseline distributions and abundance patterns. Next slide. Broad-scale data on wildlife distributions are not really produced except with federal and state agency support and involvement. But baseline studies are really important for a couple of different reasons. The two key uses of such data are one, to understand and protect the resource, so informing siting and other efforts to try to minimize impacts. And then the second is to facilitate development. As Jocelyn said, these data can be referenced by regulators, developers, and other stakeholders during permitting of offshore wind facilities. And that'll hopefully make the process both more efficient and more effective at protecting natural resources by directing effort and focus towards the species or topics that seem most important for each site. And you really need baseline data to begin to narrow that scope and use financial resources most effectively. The cool thing about this project is that we were able to provide multiple years of baseline data on a large scale for future use for these purposes. And we also used a variety of different methods and focused in part on evaluating the strengths of various approaches as well as improving existing analytical methods for future application. Next slide. So this is a simplified outline of the final report, which is almost 30 chapters in total. Study methods included both high-resolution digital video aerial surveys and boat-based surveys. And we focused quite a bit on comparing results from the boat-based and video aerial surveys to try to understand the differences between them, as well as on the potential for integrating data from both survey methods. We also conducted individual tracking for 4 focal bird species and employed several technologies focused on understanding nocturnal avian migration. Next slide. So this is kind of the spoiler slide. If you had to distill the results of the entire 4-year project down to one slide, this is it. So first, boat-based and digital video aerial surveys each had specific advantages and disadvantages, but were largely complementary. Digital aerial surveys may be particularly useful for covering offshore areas at broad spatial scales, where general distributions of taxonomic groups are a priority. And boat surveys can provide more detailed data on species identities and behaviors, but are more limited in geographic scope due to their slower survey pace. That's really all I'm going to say about the pros and cons of these two study methods today, but I am giving a webinar in December specifically focused on methods and comparisons, and I'll provide the details on that at the end of this talk. Our second key finding was that the study area was really important for wintering and breeding taxa, and its location also made it a key migratory corridor. So there was considerable variation in species composition and spatial patterns by season, and those were largely driven by dynamic environmental conditions. However, habitat gradients in nearshore waters seem to be important influences on productivity and overall patterns of species distributions and abundance. And specifically, areas offshore of the mouth of Chesapeake and Delaware Bays consistently came up as hotspots of both abundance and species diversity, regardless of survey methodology or analytical approach. So as a brief overview for the rest of the presentation here, I'm going to try and briefly run through survey methods and talk about wildlife distribution patterns that we observe both seasonally and across seasons and years, and then focus in on a couple of case studies for specific taxa where we can integrate results from multiple study components. And then I'll wrap up and open the floor for questions or discussion. So moving first to study methods. Next slide. This is our study area in the mid-Atlantic U.S., offshore of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. It stretched from 3 miles offshore to the 30-meter isobath. So the only surveys actually that occurred in state waters, so within 3 miles of shore, occurred offshore of northern Maryland. So the work was almost entirely in federal waters. The area contains 3 of the first 4 wind energy areas that were designated in the U.S., And so this study area is over 13,000 square kilometers, and that's that gray area there. The box offshore of Maryland included additional survey effort that was funded by the state of Maryland in the second year of surveys. Fieldwork was mostly conducted in March of 2012 to May of 2014. And this map is showing both boat and aerial survey transects here, which I'll get into more detail in a moment. Boat-based surveys are a traditional and widely used method of monitoring wildlife offshore, while our study was the first in the U.S. to deploy the digital video aerial survey methods on a broad scale. Next slide. We conducted 16 boat surveys over the 2 years along about 560 kilometers of transects. The transects here are shown in blue and red around the wind energy areas. The boat surveys are run by Dr. Richard Veet of the College of Staten Island. According to established protocols, surveys were conducted by teams of 2 observers on the flying bridge of the 55-foot charter vessel. We did 2 surveys per season. During the surveys, teams of 2 observers rotated and used a combination of strip and line transect methods to observe and record animals. And we also recorded some environmental data, including biomass density underwater, which was measured using a Simrad EK60 echosounder. Next slide. The boat had an intended minimum 300-meter transect strip width, though observations of animals were made up to 1,000 meters away. Next slide, please. And due to relatively slow survey speeds, so about 19 kilometers an hour, boat-based observers could record detailed data on species identities, abundance, and behaviors. Next slide. We also conducted 15 high-resolution digital video aerial surveys, and our study was the first to, as I said, to use this approach on a broad scale in the U.S., although they've become common in relation to offshore wind energy development in Europe, and have largely replaced visual aerial surveys for offshore wind energy research. Our surveys were conducted by High Def Aerial Surveying Limited, which is a company based in the UK. Our study design included intensive surveys with 1 kilometer transect spacing and 20% ground coverage within the 3 wind energy areas. And I don't know if you can see that on these maps, but there's really dense transects within those 3 wind energy area footprints, as well as in an area shown with transects in black around the Maryland wind energy area. And then we also had a lower density sawtooth pattern for broader scale contextual information throughout the remainder of the study area. It was about 3,600 kilometers of transects total, including the Maryland extension in the second year of surveys. Surveys are flown in twin-engine Cessnas fitted with 4 belly-mounted cameras that record non-overlapping strip transects. And the video records about 8 frames a second, and each frame from each camera is georeferenced. Next slide. The aircraft flew at an average speed of 135 knots and at 610 meters above sea level, so that's much higher than visual aerial surveys are normally flown, which means that digital aerial surveys tend to be much safer for those aboard and also don't disturb wildlife being surveyed the way that low-flying visual aerial surveys can. And so these are some of the reasons why we wanted to explore the capabilities of this technology in the U.S. Next slide. Analysis of the video is a multi-step process. Video was analyzed by high-def employees to isolate targets in the video and also to estimate flight height of flying animals using high-def parallax technology. And then when this process was complete, video segments were sent to BRI for analysis, and our biologists identified objects to species or species grouping. Both object location and identification processes have a detailed quality assurance and quality control protocol in which there's a blind audit or a blind re-review of 20% of the video or object. So this is some examples here of some of the still images that we extracted from the high-definition video. So on the left top, we've got a flying common loon, and below it what was identified as a small turtle, so not a leatherback sea turtle. Below that, a great shearwater, In the middle is a fin whale. And then on the right side at the top, we've got a pod of bottlenose dolphins, including several young. And the animals are at different depths below the water's surface here. And then below that, a bald eagle, and then a migratory group of cow-nose rays. Next slide. We use data from boat and aerial surveys with environmental covariate data in hierarchical models to try and understand what factors are influencing species distributions and relative abundance. And this modeling effort was overseen by Beth Gardner at North Carolina State University for seabirds and by Dave Johnston at Duke University for marine mammals and sea turtles. Distributions of animals in the marine environment can be highly variable and are driven by environmental factors working at a variety of temporal and spatial scales. So by combining our boat and aerial survey data with oceanographic habitat data, we're able to use statistical models to try to predict spatial distributions of animals based on environmental conditions. Next slide. These modeling efforts produce maps of predicted relative abundance by season for key species throughout the study area. And these are a few examples here. So the left maps show predicted abundance of birds per grid cell, 4-kilometer grid cell. So darker colors are areas of higher predicted abundance. The right maps in gray show coefficients of variation for those predictions. So in this case, the darker grid cells are actually areas with higher model uncertainty in those predicted abundance values. An advantage of this kind of analysis is that you can account for different kinds of bias associated with the data, including variation in survey effort and also distance bias, which is a common issue in boat surveys. And we can also use relationships to habitat variables and try to predict distributions and actual abundance rather than just summarizing patterns that we're seeing in our particular surveyed areas. And we also did some other types of analysis of survey data, which I'll discuss in more detail in a minute. But that's basically it for study methods. Next slide. And I'm going to get now into sort of the meat of our project results in some ways, which is the patterns of wildlife distributions, movements, and abundance that we observed in the mid-Atlantic. And I'm going to briefly look at some seasonal and interannual variations in species composition and distribution using a couple of different data sets. And then we'll discuss some more persistent distribution patterns we identified and walk through several taxon-specific case studies. Next slide, please. So a few key points. Wildlife abundance and habitat use patterns are pretty variable by taxon season and year. A lot of seabirds use the region during their non-breeding periods, which could be either in winter or austral winter, depending on where they breed. Other taxa do breed in the mid-Atlantic, including terns and sea turtles, and then a lot of species migrate through the region as well. Next slide. We use these bar charts to summarize temporal patterns of relative abundance for species and taxonomic groups in the study area. They're based on eBird bar charts, if you're familiar with those. So basically, the data are standardized for survey effort and then categorized by percentile. And the boat and aerial bars are placed side by side. So the boat data is in dark green, and the aerial data is in that kind of reddish-orange color for each 2-month time period. So again, larger bars represent higher counts of a species or group. Community composition varies seasonally. So at the top, wintering seabirds were around in the area for actually a considerable part of the year, either migrating through or wintering in the area. And the same is true for summer residents, such as terns and storm petrels. Songbirds and shorebirds primarily were observed in the mid-Atlantic study area during spring and fall migration, although they were seen during other time periods as well. Cetaceans, both dolphins and baleen whales, were observed year-round, although there were clear species-specific differences in these temporal patterns. And turtles, rays, and forage fish were generally observed in warmer months, so spring, summer, and fall. Next slide, please. And here we're specifically looking at wintering seabirds as an example of interannual variation. So this is the entire wintering seabird community minus goaters, which were modeled separately, and we'll see more on them in a few minutes. Winter was a period of highest avian abundance in the study area. We had more than 20 different seabird species present in the winter, mostly loons, gannets, alcids, and gulls. Not surprisingly, given the dynamic nature of marine ecosystems, we saw considerable interannual variation in our 2 years of surveys. And overall abundance of the wintering seabird community was notably higher during the second winter of the study, so that's the right-hand map, than the first winter that we surveyed. There were also variable relationships with environmental covariates between survey years, actually, so distance from shore became much less important as a predictor in the second year of surveys than it was in the first year. We'll see more about temporal variability and wildlife distributions in the taxonomic case studies. But despite this kind of variation, there were some patterns that showed up pretty consistently between taxon years, which we'll talk about next. Next slide. So we defined hotspots of abundance as locations where individuals within a species or species group were consistently observed in numbers greater than a standardized baseline for each survey. And the goal here was to try to identify spatial patterns of species abundance that persist through time and that could indicate locations of important habitat areas. Next slide. So observation and effort data were binned into grid cells. In this case, they're actually BOEM leaf blocks. And we fitted distribution to non-zero effort-corrected counts for each survey and considered grid cells within the top quartile to be hotspots for that survey. And then calculated the percentage of time that each grid cell was a hotspot across all surveys within a given survey method to try to develop an index of hotspot persistence relative to the number of times that a leaf block was surveyed. So this map shows grid cells that were surveyed by either the boat, the plane, or both. There are 450 leaf blocks total. And to combine boat and aerial survey data for leaf blocks that were surveyed by both methods, which is those darker blue blocks on the map, we weighted each value by effort-corrected total abundance for the complete data set, so that the combined value was weighted towards the survey method that was generally better at either detecting or identifying the taxon of interest. Next slide. So the end maps index the persistence of high abundance areas across the 2-year duration of the study. And the colors range from no color, which is never a hotspot, to red, which is in the 95th percentile for persistence of hotspots across all grid cells and surveys in which a taxon was present. And so these maps, this map here represents all animals observed in the study via both boat and digital aerial surveys in all seasons. And so this is showing areas with consistently greater numbers of individuals across all taxon surveys. Most leaf blocks here are a hotspot during at least one survey because this map includes all species. And so there's a lot of variation in distribution patterns between species. Next slide, please. Now on the right, this is actually persistent species richness hotspots. And so this is areas with consistently greater numbers of species across all surveys rather than abundance of individual animals. If you look at the two maps together, they actually show fairly similar overall patterns, which indicates that it's not just the most abundant species that are driving the patterns you see in the map on the left. It's actually a lot of different species within the community that are following similar patterns through time. Areas near the mouths of Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay seem to remain important for many different taxa throughout the year, specifically waters adjacent to and directly south of the bay mouths, within roughly 30 kilometers or so of shore, consistently showed high species diversity and abundance of animals across all taxa observed in this study. Areas offshore of northern Maryland, where high-density surveys were conducted in nearshore areas, also showed high diversity and abundance. And I think that's a real pattern, but it's also the only area where surveys were conducted in state waters. So partially, I think that's an artifact of the nearshore distribution for many taxa, which we only picked up on in that location. So nearshore areas within about 30 to 40 kilometers of shore, and particularly near the mouths of large bays, were probably attractive to a lot of animals due to consistently high primary productivity relative to the broader study area. These locations probably provided a reliable foraging habitat for a lot of species. And we saw this distribution pattern repeated for many specific taxa. I'm going to go into some case studies next, and we'll see some taxa really follow this pattern quite closely. And there are some exceptions to this pattern as well. Next slide, please. The northern gannet was one of the most common species we observed in boat and aerial surveys. In North America, they winter along the Atlantic coast of the U.S. and the Gulf of Mexico. And they were in our study area primarily in about October to April. And this image down on the bottom right here is actually a still shot from the aerial video surveys of gannets plunge diving and sitting on the water surface, which is a really cool behavior to detect in the video. Northern gannets are a species of interest in relation to offshore wind because European vulnerability assessments have suggested that they may be at risk of collision with offshore wind turbines. And they've also been displaced from several offshore wind facilities in Europe, causing effective habitat loss. Next slide, please. On the left, we're looking at predicted abundance of northern gannets for a given date in the winter of 2013-2014. So these are boat survey data here. Northern gannets roamed quite widely over continental shelf waters, but showed greatest use of habitats closer to shore, especially in areas with high primary productivity. On the right, when we look at persistent hotspots identified using both boat and aerial survey data, we see a very similar pattern, actually, with broad use of the shelf waters, but greatest use of more nearshore waters, and in particular around the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, where productivity is high. So we had different analytical goals for these two maps, but overall, you seem to show pretty similar geographic distribution patterns of potential exposure for northern gannets during the 2 years that we studied. Next slide, please. So the bottom line, I think, is northern gannets had quite a broad-scale distribution and also broad-scale movements during winter, which may increase the likelihood that individuals would be in the vicinity of offshore wind developments in the mid-Atlantic repeatedly throughout the season. Important foraging and habitat use areas for this species appeared to be defined by a wide variety of habitat characteristics. And construction and operations of offshore wind energy facilities could potentially cause some localized displacement anywhere in the study area, but that would be most likely within about 30 to 40 kilometers of shore where London. Next slide, please. Like northern gannets, red-throated loons were present in the study area in the fall, winter, and spring. Red-throated loons are of interest in relation to offshore wind because European studies indicate that they experience long-term localized displacement and disturbance from wind energy facilities, as well as related activities such as vessel traffic. Next slide, please. Red-throated loons were more consistently observed within about 20 kilometers of shore, and so this is a much more constrained distribution than we saw for northern gannets a few slides ago. Modeled boat survey data indicated that proximity to shore was the strongest predictor of abundance for this species, followed by relatively cold sea surface temperature and high primary productivity. Next slide. And so now we have a map of persistent hotspots for red-throated loons, and this shows a similar nearshore distribution pattern of hotspots of abundance for this species. Next slide. And the map coming up on the right here is actually a hotspot map for common loons. And you'll see that the hotspots for common loons are actually much more widely distributed longitudinally than are the ones for red-throated loons. And this represents some work from both BRI and North Carolina State University. The majority of loons that we saw in surveys were common loons, but it varied quite a bit by survey and with habitat covariates. So the probability of a loon being a red-throated loon noticeably decreased with distance from shore. Next slide. In winter, red-throated loons were most commonly located west of the wind energy areas in the mid-Atlantic. So the greatest overlap between red-throated loon distributions and the mid-Atlantic wind energy areas actually occurred during migration periods when their movements tended to be located farther offshore. Next slide. Our next case study here is scoters. We have 3 species of scoter that winter in the mid-Atlantic. So the surf scoter, black scoter, and white-winged scoter. And this chart shows the year-round relative abundance of surf scoters, although all species show a pretty similar pattern here. They were most commonly observed in the winter, and really none were observed in May to August. European studies indicate that scoters may be displaced from areas around offshore wind facilities for some period following construction. The sort of degree and duration of that displacement seems to be variable among studies. There's some suggestion of possible habituation or possibly changes in distributions in relation to prey, but they are definitely another species of interest in relation to offshore winds. Next slide. On the left, we have model predictions of scoter distributions from a given day in winter 2012-2013. So the highest abundance predicted is predicted for areas close to shore and with high primary productivity. And then on the right, we have a persistent hotspot map for scoters observed in boat and video aerial surveys. And that really calls out those areas offshore the mouth of Chesapeake and Delaware Bays as being key scoter habitats where we most consistently observe them in large numbers. And the species-specific hotspot maps for scoters all looked quite similar to this combined hotspot map here. Next slide. Scoters are benthic feeders generally, so they're often found in shallower waters inshore of the wind energy areas. And that held true across species. In the mid-Atlantic, construction and operation of offshore wind energy facilities and associated vessel traffic would be most likely to probably cause localized displacement of scoters if those activities occurred within about 20 kilometers of shore. Next slide. Sea turtles were most abundant in the mid-Atlantic from May to October. There are very few present in the region in the winter. There are not a lot of sea turtles in the North and Baltic Seas, which is where most of Europe's offshore wind facilities are located to date. So we don't have a lot of information on the effects of offshore wind on turtle species. Potential concerns identified in the literature include the effects of noise and the potential for collisions with vessels. Next slide. We recorded all 5 species that are present in the region. Loggerhead and leatherback sea turtles were the most commonly observed. Abundance models predicted a broad distribution across the entire region, especially offshore, farther offshore, and in the fall. And there was substantial overlap with wind energy areas, particularly the Virginia wind energy area in the southern part of the study area, and all 3 wind energy areas in the fall. Next slide. I didn't really get into this today, but digital aerial surveys were highly effective at detecting sea turtles, although we did have some difficulty distinguishing the smaller species, particularly if they were submerged. But we actually only used the aerial survey data to develop predictive models. We didn't have enough observations in the boat data to really be useful. So those output maps in the previous slide were all based on the digital aerial survey data sets. Construction of offshore wind energy facilities in mid-Atlantic wind energy areas will probably be the biggest period for noise production, and that's likely to occur in warmer months. And sea turtles will be present during these periods and could be exposed, but the effects of that exposure are really uncertain right now. Next slide. Many marine mammals rely on sound to communicate, and all are thought to be sensitive to noise pollution. So offshore wind energy facilities do present significant increases in underwater noise during construction, which may affect all marine mammals. We have some effects data on smaller marine mammals, so porpoises and seals from Europe, but we have a poorer understanding of the hazards posed to baleen whales by offshore wind energy development. We didn't have enough whale data or common dolphin data to really model their distributions. Common dolphins, though, were definitely more common in cooler months and also offshore. Bottlenose dolphins were more frequent in warmer months. They're really uncommon in the winter. Next slide. In spring, summer, and fall, distance to shore, primary productivity, and sea surface temperature were all important predictors of bottlenose dolphin distributions. And a strong nearshore distribution was predicted in spring and fall, which is possibly driven by the species' resident coastal stocks. There was a more robust density gradient west to east in the summer, which our colleagues at Duke speculated may have been because there was an influx of transient animals during the warmer months. Next slide. This map shows all of our large whale observations from both our boat and aerial surveys. It's a fairly small number of observations overall, but this is a key taxonomic group of interest. Baleen whales were mostly observed in the winter. All 9 of our North Atlantic right whale observations were in February and March. Although I would note that passive acoustic studies that BOEM has been funding in recent years have suggested the possibility that right whales could be present in these areas year-round, even though we were only detecting them visually in the winter. Video footage of North Atlantic right whales was actually clear enough to identify some individual animals from the footage using the right whale photographic catalog, which is also kind of cool. Next slide. So we know relatively little about migratory routes for some of these large whale species in the mid-Atlantic, although data from this and other studies are beginning to fill this gap. Bottlenose dolphins may be most likely to be exposed to development activities during summer and in the northern end of the study area, as well as in western areas of the mid-Atlantic WEAs in spring and fall. And common dolphins, as I said, have a more offshore distribution and may be particularly abundant in wind energy areas during winter and spring. Next slide. So that's it for case studies. We also had some other interesting findings that I would highlight if I had the time, but I want to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions as well. But this is a list of some other topics we examined. If you have an interest in any of these, ask about it during the Q&A session, and I can talk about it a little bit more. Next slide. I've tried to cover a lot of information in a short period of time here today, but in broad strokes, our main findings from the Mid-Atlantic Baseline Studies project were that boat and digital video aerial surveys each had some strengths and weaknesses for assessing wildlife populations. Distribution and abundance of wildlife was driven by several environmental variables. Delaware Bay and Chesapeake Bay had very strong influences on wildlife distributions in the Mid-Atlantic region, and that's likely related to gradients in salinity, water temperature, primary productivity, and other factors offshore the mouths of the bays. And while there were large amounts of variation between individuals, species, seasons, and years, we did see some patterns of more nearshore distributions in terms of both overall abundance and species richness. Next slide. So the hope is that by using this kind of baseline information on wildlife movements and habitat use, we can make more informed decisions about where to place development, Regulators can more easily navigate the environmental permitting process because they have some broad-scale baseline data to reference when they're evaluating development proposals. And we can develop some approaches to avoid or minimize potential conflicts between wildlife and future offshore wind farms on the Atlantic outer continental shelf. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, we focused in this study on understanding when animals are in a potential development area, where and in what numbers. And as development continues in the U.S., it will be key to focus on the species that we think may be most likely to be affected. And that could be either due to their predicted exposure, as with this study, or to their behaviors or conservation status as well. We've gotten very positive feedback thus far on the utility of these results from state and federal regulators and developers. And so we're really hopeful that this baseline study can make a difference during the development process for the mid-Atlantic wind energy areas, both by informing the permitting process and maybe simplifying it a bit, and also helping to better protect natural resources in this region. Next slide. Both the full final project report and the 32-page summary report are available on the project website, which is listed here. They've also been posted to the TSIS database. And as Dawson mentioned, our survey data are also publicly available for download from the project webpage and have also been sent to the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog, formerly the Compendium of Avian, which is housed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next slide. I'll be doing another webinar on the project, which I mentioned in case you're interested in more information. The webinar on December 2nd is going to be focused on distribution and abundance patterns of wildlife, and instead of focusing on distribution and abundance patterns of wildlife, which is what I did today, it's going to be more focused on study methods, so comparing results from boat and digital video aerial surveys and the different types of information we were able to get from different study techniques. And also, if there's something specific you're interested in, don't hesitate to get in touch with me directly. Next slide. My email address is on this page here. And thank you very much to the Department of Energy, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and Maryland Energy Administration, and all of our collaborators. And thank you all for your time today, and I am happy to take questions.
Okay, and ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask your question over the phone lines, you can do so by pressing #2 on your telephone handset. You will be notified once your line is unmuted, and pressing #2 again will remove you from the question queue. Also, you can still type in your questions by using the Notes tab in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and you can address those to all presenters.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Kate, for that excellent presentation. We have received a couple written questions, so I guess we will take care of those right now. So the National Marine Fisheries Service conducts a trawl survey or fish census from Cape Hatteras to the Canadian border. Have you had any thought in incorporating these data into your assessment?
Yeah, so this study was somewhat self-contained in terms of the analyses that we were doing, but we've definitely been discussing trying to incorporate other data sets and specifically actually to compare results from our surveys, our 2 years of surveys, with some other ongoing efforts and trying to see whether we were seeing sort of similar patterns. Specifically and related to fish, Colin, can you flip to the next slide? Actually, I've got a couple of spare slides here. Even our study was specifically focused on birds, marine mammals, and sea turtles. Oh, sorry, next slide. Somewhere in here I have a forage fish slide, but anyway, from looking at, here it is. So even though we weren't specifically focused on fish, we did, as I mentioned earlier, look at prey biomass densities underwater using an echosounder on the survey vessel, which is these 4 maps on the right. And then we also actually picked up on schools of fish near the water surface in the digital video aerial surveys. And in some cases, we saw just enormous schools of fish that went on for kilometers. And if the fish were small and weren't individually sort of identifiable, those got marked as schools rather than as individuals. And the map on the left here is showing the locations of all of those schools from the aerial data. And so you can kind of see a similar nearshore pattern that we saw overall in terms of both abundance and species diversity. And so to some extent, the prey fish populations may be driving the relatively nearshore distributions for many marine mammals and sea turtles.
Okay, great. How was the difference in availability of diving animals between boat-based and aerial survey platforms accounted for?
For aquatic animals, for the modeling work, we actually mostly used one or the other. So for persistent hotspots, we didn't account for detectability. Those were sort of raw counts. We corrected for effort, but not detection. For the modeling work, though, that Duke University did, they ended up using either the boat data as for bottlenose dolphins or the aerial data as the sea turtles. So we didn't really get into the differences in availability between the two survey methods. Overall, it seemed like we had a little bit better detectability for aquatic animals from the aerial data, and that's probably partially because you could actually see animals that were fully submerged, and they didn't actually have to break the surface in order to be detected.
Okay. And Kate, you mentioned that sea turtles were perhaps at risk from noise of offshore wind installations. Do you have specific studies that confirm this potential effect? Or know of potential studies?
Yeah. So there's a recent BOEM report, and if whoever asked this question wants to email me, I can send you some references. There is a recent BOEM report on, I believe, leatherback sea turtles, I think, that found that leatherback hearing ranges overlapped with the sort of ranges of frequencies that are produced during pile driving and operational turbine noise and a lot of the activities related to offshore wind. And there's been some limited laboratory studies suggesting that sea turtles exhibit kind of behavioral responses like startle responses or avoidance when they're exposed to loud noises. How applicable some of that is to the specific noises produced by offshore wind-related activities and in the actual marine environment, I think is somewhat unclear right now.
Interesting. You said this is a past BOEM report, though, you mentioned?
Yeah, it was published in either 2012 or 2013. And there's been some other sort of small-scale studies over the years, mostly laboratory studies that have looked at sea turtle hearing levels, and they do seem to be able to hear low-frequency sounds, but they have a sort of slightly different system of hearing things than some other animals, and I think it's still something we're learning about.
Right. Okay. Are there plans for passive acoustic studies to get better information on whale distribution patterns?
Yeah, I believe BOEM is funding several studies they have in areas outside of the Mid-Atlantic, and then I think they and the state of Maryland are currently funding passive acoustic studies offshore of both Virginia and Maryland right now.
Okay. And this is just a general question from previously in the presentation, but are the predicted abundance maps by month that you were showing earlier?
Yeah, they're by season.
By season.
Okay. So it's winter, spring, summer, or fall. There often are not enough data from a single survey to really be able to develop predictions very well, and so we'll combine a couple of surveys from a given season, like winter, to produce predictions.
Okay, great. One question just came in. Let's see. So it was mentioned construction will be occurring during the seasons where it was found marine mammals and sea turtles are present in highest abundance. Why not shoot for months when they will be lower in abundance rather than the busy season?
Yeah, well, that's something that's going to have to be discussed between developers and regulators as they work through their construction and operations plans. But
right.
My understanding is that generally speaking, weather offshore is chancy enough in winter and difficult enough that it can be really hard to do construction during winter months, and that usually developers will aim to try and do a lot of those activities in warmer months where there's more consistent, sort of easier weather.
Right. So we have a couple more coming in, but I was also wondering if maybe you can touch on some of the bat results that you also found. I know you mentioned it at the end. It probably didn't have that much time to get into too much detail with those, but maybe you can provide some high-level results.
Yeah. Colin, can you go to the next slide? I think that's where the bat slide on here. But so we didn't have a ton of bat observations offshore, but we did see mostly eastern red bats during fall migration, 17 bats in all from the aerial and boat surveys, 90% of them in the aerial surveys, which was totally unexpected. I mean, these surveys are not designed to pick up on bats at all. But we did pick up on them specifically in the aerial surveys. And in those aerial surveys, the bats we observed were flying higher than could be detected from the boat, so 100 to 200 meters in altitude or more. They also were seen flying during the day, because we were surveying during the day, which was kind of unexpected as well. When we saw them, there weren't any like recent storms or anything that might have blown them offshore that we could tell. It seemed like they were out there intentionally. It's unclear what proportion of migrating bats are using offshore habitats, maybe a very small proportion, but it seems like a taxon that's worth at least mentioning because it was so unexpected for us to pick up on them during surveys, and also because they are a taxon of concern in relation to terrestrial winds.
Right.
And actually, we published a paper in PLOS ONE, if anyone's interested in some of the bat work. It's Hatch et al. 2013. And if you want to email me, I can send you the link to it.
Okay, great. And we have one more question that just came in. Maybe we'll take this as the last question. Could you elaborate more on the satellite telemetry data? What species, how many tags, the high use areas from your tagging work align with information gleaned from your survey work?
Sure. So the 4 species we looked at with satellite telemetry were peregrine falcons, red-throated loons, northern gannets, and surf scoters. Peregrine falcons were specific to this project, and I think we had a sample size of 12, if I'm remembering right, so relatively small sample size. They're not normally thought of as, a marine bird, but they flew often hundreds of kilometers offshore and could actually stay in those areas for weeks. And I have a couple slides earlier on this. We actually had birds peregrine falcons that flew way offshore and roosted on boats out in the middle of the Atlantic, and then were, we think, probably hunting from the boats and roosting on them for days, which is pretty interesting. For the seabird species, red-throated loons, northern gannets, and surf scoters, the red-throated loon and northern gannet work was part of a study that was developed by BOEM and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Migratory Birds, and that's still ongoing. And I don't remember sample sizes off the top of my head. It's in the 40 to 50 individuals per species range, I think. And then surf scoters are actually part of that study, as well as an ongoing SeaDuck joint venture study with a lot of different collaborators internationally that's been going on for almost 15 years now. And that group was kind enough to let us use sort of a broader sample of tag birds dating back to 2001, actually. So our sample size in some of the preliminary analyses we did for surf scoters was more like 101, I think. So these are very collaborative efforts, but bringing together, tags from multiple sources, we have pretty good sample size for telemetry studies. A lot of the telemetry results, a lot of the birds are captured sort of more in the bays or at the bay mouths. And so you're getting a lot more information about distributions actually in the bays rather than offshore, which is where all of our surveys were. But in general, I'd say we're seeing some pretty similar patterns. If you look at the telemetry data, and I mean, it depends how you analyze it, but if you look at, say, utilization distributions in the winter based on the telemetry results, you'll see that northern gannets range a lot farther out onto the shelf than red-throated loons and surf scoters do, for example. But the cool thing about this telemetry data is that it can give you some really nice information on individual movements and sort of individual home range sizes and migration timing and things like that that you really can't get from the survey data. So it's kind of nice to be able to do both, to really get a better handle on not only where animals are at a given point in time, but sort of how they're moving around and using the space. So I'll be excited to see some of those results starting to get published next year.
Yeah, definitely. Well, great. I think with that, we are 5 past the hour, so I think we'll wrap things up. But I'd like to just thank you all for listening in to this great webinar, and thank you, Kate and BRI, for the wonderful presentation. As she mentioned, the report is available on TPIS as well as on the BRI site, and the associated data can also be accessed from the BRI site. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.